What's the connection between creating a fantasy world for Dungeons and Dragons and the country of Albania? Are you living in a fantastical world of someone else's creation? What's the connection with Nazi Germany? Welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes, and these are tales by humans for humans. After all, words and stories are what give meaning to the worlds we live in. In our previous episode, we explored the idea of creating worlds for writing, and especially tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. In that episode, which is, by the way, episode 54 if you want to take a listen, I noted that because our entire lives are spent within the imagination of our own creations, there is a connection to, manufacturing reality. This week, I invited back to the show my friend, my former professor, and longtime collaborator on this podcast, Dr. Erwin Warkentin, to discuss the topic of creating worlds and the intersection with propaganda. Dr. Warkentin has not only led media and communications at Memorial University in Canada, he has written and studied extensively on the subject of propaganda. So, here's our discussion. So last week, Erwin, I had an episode about world building, as you know, and I was discussing fantasy world building. So it's great to have you back on the show again, Dr. Warkentin.
Well, it's great to be here.
In the podcast episode, I talked about the fact that it didn't matter whether it was fiction or nonfiction, you still had to build a world. And then it struck me, a lot of world building is about building mental models and putting it into other people's heads. And of course, as we were chatting, it became obvious to me that this has a different intersect, a much darker intersection.
Yeah, it does. We don't actually have control of this fantasy world of our own. Well, I say of our own. We assume it's our own, but it's actually been put there by other people. People who want us to do things in certain ways that will, shall we say, enrich them.
What do you mean?
Well, when you think of what you do and how you react to people, it has to come from somewhere. How we form ourselves as a society. It's not that we all of a sudden one day thought to ourselves, we're going to do things this way. And then off we go and we do our thing. It's because there have been all kinds of politicians in our lives who have decided that they have a good idea. And they are then going to propagate their good idea into our world. That is, these individual worlds that we live in. And so what they do is they construct a world for us, or a worldview. And I use that word propagate very, not advisedly, but very purposely, because that's where we get this word propaganda. And propaganda today has a negative connotation. And I'm not trying to resurrect that as some sort of a good connotation at all. We'll leave it where it is. But up until Joseph Goebbels came along, it actually was kind of positive. It was only after Goebbels got a hold of it that it suddenly became negative. But that didn't mean that everybody didn't use propaganda at all. I do have a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. And one of them is this fascinating example that I came across. That's this fellow by the name of Enver Hoxha. He was the first secretary of the Communist Party in Albania.
And Albania is a country, actually was neighbors of Yugoslavia, correct? At the
Exactly.
time. Now, of course, Serbia, Montenegro, and so on.
Precisely. And the interesting thing is I just had this wonderful vacation in Corfu. And when I looked out from Corfu, I wasn't looking at Greece. Across the channel, that was Albania. It was isolated from all of Europe.
In fact, if you actually looked at it, it was one of the most isolated countries in the world, very similar to North Korea today.
Exactly. And the thing is, it wasn't just isolated from the West. It was fairly isolated even from Eastern Europe, from the USSR and such, because this place was so crazy that even The communists in the USSR were going, wow, those guys are nuts.
And as I understand it, actually, if they were even isolated from the Maoists in China.
Absolutely.
He was very paranoid about everybody and everything.
And the odd thing is, we sometimes think of these people as being different in many ways, and I guess he was, but he had a fairly good education. He went to the University the Free University of Belgium. He was also at the university in Montpellier in France. Mind you, he didn't complete anything. He was basically a lousy student, and he fancied himself a writer, a real genius of a writer. But this is where it gets really, really interesting, though. What he did is he made everyone in his country read his stuff. It was required reading, not just in the schools, but if you wanted any sort of position in the country, you had to know his stuff. Now, he produced approximately 71 volumes of material. That works out to somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 pages, about 9 million words. If we want to kind of extrapolate from that, that's approximate. And he had something to say on just about everything. And what he was doing was creating a world in these people's minds without them really even realizing it. I think they were maybe struggling with, well, why do I have to read all of this stuff? Well, they needed to read it so that he could, first of all, force them to do something that they perhaps didn't want to do, but also put ideas into their heads, into their worlds, and create this fantasy fictional world of his own.
It's quite fascinating. I was looking up some statistics in preparation for this episode, and one of the incredible things is today, even after I believe almost 35, 40 years of Albania being opened up, the older generation still has a favorable view of this man. Now, the younger generation believe he was a dictator, but the older generation believes that life was good under this man, and certainly that he was not to blame for anything. And I find that fascinating.
Well, I think there's a little bit of Stockholm syndrome going on. The people who are the prisoners suddenly start identifying with their captors. There were some things where you look at it on the surface, you think, oh yeah, okay, that's kind of, he's way ahead of everybody else. For example, with women's rights. On the one hand, if you look at it one way, he was a huge champion of women being treated equally. The problem was he was killing all the men, so he needed somebody to do the work for him. But that's another matter altogether, I suppose. I think he needed to then create this Albania that existed in his mind, and he wanted it to exist in everybody else's minds as well.
When you look at this, and the most incredible thing to me is how an entire nation, this isn't me believing in a fantasy world where some characters are running around with swords. This is an entire nation believing in the world and the model that this person has created. Now, I'm sure there were, of course, outliers, but we're talking the majority of a nation.
Yeah, and the odd thing is that what you just described, I see some of it here in Berlin. I live in a part of Berlin that is the Old East. In fact, we're very, very close to where their elite guards had their barracks, and it was kind of Stasi central. Stasi was the secret police. There was a time I was sitting in a cafe, not far from where we live here, struck up a conversation with this older gentleman. He asked, "Oh, where do you live?" And I happened to mention where I live. And as I said that, he shuddered and he kind of did a double take on me. And then I could see him calm himself down. And I asked him, "Okay, what just happened here?" And I thought maybe there was something physical going on. And because it had kind of manifested itself as a physical thing, he then said, "I just have to remind myself that time is over." Because where you live is where the high-ranking officials had their villas. When I said where I lived, he naturally kind of associated me with them, even though it's 35 years later. Yeah, I can understand how that can happen. So yes, these people couldn't necessarily see the bad in what he had done. Just the same way that when you talk to some East Germans today, they have, and in German we have this term called Ostalgie, and it's kind of fallen out of favor now, and it's maybe not as apparent as it once was. Ostalgie is a play on this word nostalgie, which takes the word ost, which means east. So it's this nostalgia for the old East. So yes, that does happen, and it's because this world has been created in their minds, and they still live in that world where maybe they had some benefits that they didn't have today. The interesting thing is, however, if you ask them, do you want to go back to those times? They will say, no, no, absolutely no. This is just fine the way we have it right here, right now. I think the reality then hits them at some point where they say, yeah, okay, what we have today is maybe not perfect, but it's not so bad.
But this brings to mind something else. When you look at even the countries we live in, or the countries we're from, and the political systems that are part of it, if I were to go back 60 years and I would have talked to someone in Yugoslavia or in Albania or even the Soviet Union, they would have said, we were living under some sort of tyranny.
Absolutely.
Now, it's a different tyranny because they saw our world from their lens. And we, of course, see it as complete freedom. But the truth is, we've fashioned a world, a reality around us that says we are in the right.
Absolutely. Germany has its Hitler and Goebbels, and Italy had its Mussolini. The Soviet Union had Marx and Engels. Okay, we Germans have to take responsibility for those two, but then they also have their Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev. North Korea has its Kims. They all use propaganda to kind of move their agenda forward. And that was, okay, bad in the West, good over here. We had our own people. We had our Winston Churchills, for example. Now, there was a great storyteller and someone who could really create a world in your mind for you. He always had a wonderful saying, and he was sometimes thought of as not a very nice person. But do you think we have that memory anymore? Not so much. United States, there you've got your JFK, you have Camelot. Everything was wonderful in Camelot. Charles de Gaulle in France. And then in Canada, of course, we've got our Trudeaus. I'm not a Trudeau basher at all. There's some things I really didn't care about, but they also fed us all kinds of stories that kind of had us as kind of the pinnacle of social development.
Well, truly, my father was a huge Trudeau fan. In fact, I remember when I decided to move to Canada, he was very proud of that. He was very happy about Canada. I distinctly remember that the Canadian government had to run ads or at least have PSAs, public service announcements, that the legal system as seen in Law and Order, on the television show Law and Order, is not the legal system that the Canadians actually have. You don't actually have the right to remain silent, or the things that the police say in every cop show. And that's because the mental model of the world and our legal system that we created, the world that we live in, came from the shows that we would watch on American television, which was very much everywhere in Canada.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right there. I remember some of these announcements being made. If you look today, at some of these TikToks and the shorts on YouTube, they will show, Americans reacting to being pulled over in Canada. Some Canadian police officer, whether it's RCMP or OPP, trying to explain to the American that, no, that's not the way it works here.
There are no Miranda rights. It's quite fascinating to me in just even having this conversation. I mean, we live in a world that we've created. This is all the rules, the fact that there's a red octagonal sign that says stop and we all stop is in and of itself a rule, a crazy thing that we've created. The priests in our religious services or religion itself. It's all a world that we build for ourselves, and then we spend our time in it. And so I have to ask you the question: are we living in a fantastical world, Evan?
Yes, we are. Absolutely. We can't help but be living in this fantastical world. How else can we arrange things around us in a fashion that we can understand them? The thing is, though, that the stories that we use to create that world are not of our own imagination, but they're the imaginations of others or people wanting us to see the world in a specific way. And so, yeah, we may not be living in a fantasy of our own, but rather maybe look at it this way: we're living in another's fantasy world.
I see what you're getting at. For me, when I'm looking at it from the lens of a writer creating worlds for people to live in, and people tell me, I don't like fantasy or science fiction because it's completely alien to the world I live in, I'm always a little bit confused because I truly do believe that every writer has to create a world for their characters to walk inside of. And all I have to do is look around the world and I see everyone living in their own version of the reality that others have told them. And it is so easy to influence and manipulate that reality that they don't even realize what's happening.
Here's an example. I think this might actually expand on what you just said. I had a colleague once who challenged me. He said, you talk so much about yourself. I know all of this stuff about you. I feel as though I know too much about you." And I smiled and essentially said, "Well, yeah, but you only know what I want you to know. And you're also making the assumption that it's the truth." I think that really soured this former colleague of mine on me because all of a sudden he didn't know what to believe about me. That's how all of this works. When we say a fantasy world, it could simply be an outright lie that it's based on. On a national sort of scale, countries are forever telling their citizens how they should understand their country. I don't know if you remember these heritage minutes, how much those heritage moments are pure fantasy. And by pure fantasy, I can also talk about things that are omitted, that are left out. There's some 90 or so of these heritage minutes that have been produced over the years. But if you think of, the thing on the Vikings that they do, a lot of what they present in that is actually pure fantasy. It used to be accepted as truth, but nowadays, if you look at it, you go, "Oh, okay, yeah, the historians don't really view that way anymore." Or the piece they do on McClung. Nellie McClung was, I think, a tremendous leader in Western Canada. She comes from my hometown, from Winnipeg. She even represented Canada, I believe, at the League of Nations or the United Nations. She's an incredibly important woman. On the other hand, however, she also was involved in the eugenics movement. And this was one of the core things in Nazism. And she was a very strong believer in certain people shouldn't be allowed to breed. That doesn't appear in the piece on Nellie McClung.
But I think we can go into many, many different examples of how propaganda is really the small things. And we don't always see propaganda happening right in front of our very own eyes. In the same way that you're talking about the heritage minutes in Canada, you can also talk about, very little things like commemoration of certain historical events, statues, the way that we might even sing our national anthem. It can be any number of these different things that create the world that we're living in, which to me is quite fascinating and also quite scary at how easily we can manipulate people towards, well, where we started this whole story, to a crazy person who decides to hold a nation hostage.
It is surprising how easy it is actually to do. And sometimes it may be inadvertent. In some cases, I would think, okay, well, no, it can't be inadvertent. This has to have been concocted in a way that it was going a very specific direction. Another example, this is not a Canadian example now, this is an example from the UK. And we had these shows in Canada too. They have them in the United States, they have them in Australia. And it's these kind of border force kind of reality shows. These actually ran for quite some time. There were a number of different ones in the UK, for example. I have to think that there's some sort of connection between those shows and the Brexit movement, because they appeared, in the 10 years running up to Brexit in Britain and the vote. And what they consistently showed was people who were not white, we'll say people of color, coming across the border and trying to get into Britain by some illegal means. And this kind of created this fantasy world that Britain was under siege and something needed to be done. And clearly, that thing that they needed to do was get out of the EU, because that was the problem.
Do you know if anyone's actually studied that?
I have not seen anything along those lines. And this is something that it had been niggling at the back of my mind. And I hadn't really been able to kind of put my finger on what I thought the issue was. I haven't had a lot of time to kind of do my literature review, as it were, but I don't think there has been.
But to be fair, we all know that, and this, of course, goes back to Joseph Goebbels and the Ministry of Propaganda in the Nazi state. Ultimately, the ability to harness the power of media to tell a specific story over and over and over again can create the society that you wish. And I was thinking, from a fantastical point of view, if you remember the H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds broadcast on radio in the 1930s, if I remember correctly. And what happened there, for those who don't know, was that the Orson Welles narration of H.G. Wells' story of the War of the Worlds, that created a mass panic because everyone thought that there was an alien invasion. Now, if you imagine a person getting up in the morning and seeing on their TikTok that you have an alien invasion, you turn on television, you have an alien invasion, you go on a newspaper on the subway, it says alien invasion in headlines. How can you argue that there's no alien invasion?
But you have to also look at your sources. Where is it coming from? And part of the problem we have today is our news sources have been eroded, or our trust in our news sources have been eroded. And we will trust somebody with a handy cam over someone who's been kind of reporting the news, I guess, for years and years and years, simply because we have certain political parties and people who don't like the way they report the news.
And I'm going to stop you there, because this is one of the points where I actually somewhat disagree with you. When I was writing news, one of the things that I realized very quickly was the way that I ordered the story and the choice of words that I opted for. And when I was editing the newspaper and the edits that I would make to articles, still to this day, I can recall how I made edits to make sure a piece was the way that I thought it ought to be. And I don't think that has been different at all. So I think one of the things that I feel kind of annoyed about when people talk about media today and media in the 1980s or 70s or 60s, as if that was fantastic, is that in those days, the newspapers were being controlled by very big conglomerates, and those editors had huge say in how the news got reported. So what is the difference between then and now? Just that it's more prevalent and it's harder to find the source versus then?
I think you bring up a very valid and a very good point. I think we have a certain arrogance today about how news is reported. And no, I'm not suggesting that the news sources, the traditional news sources, are the problem. What I was suggesting is that our trust in those sources has been eroded, and not necessarily by the news outlet. And this is an area in which I actually did some very in-depth studies. And that had to do with the news organizations in Germany right after World War II. That's after they'd come through this world of propaganda where they were told basically by Goebbels and Hitler, what to report, how to report it. The Americans that came in, and there was an organization called the ICD, that's the Information Control Division. It was part of OMGUS, that was Office Military Government US. And what they did is they essentially dismantled the entire media landscape in Germany and put it back together. And they had very, very strict ideas on how to do it. And the funny thing is, it was a bunch of idealists, university students. Some of them hadn't quite completed their university degrees yet, who were the officers who were putting this thing together. And the interesting thing in the reports that were going back to Washington was that Germany is going to end up with a better news service than what we have in the United States. Because one of the things that they did is if you had a newspaper, the owner of that newspaper, first of all, you couldn't have a single owner of a newspaper or any sort of media outlet, whether it published books, whatever it happened to be. They had so much control, they even controlled, whether a church printed a bulletin. They had to get permission to do that. And they had to know who the person who was in charge of actually publishing or printing this. If you had a news organization or some sort of media organization, it could not be owned by one person. There had to be at least 3. Their preference was for 5 owners, and that's because they wanted each of the 5 different major political parties in Germany to have at least one voice in each of the owners. Germany still suffers under some of that. They're sometimes very hesitant in reporting things. But the funny thing is, in the United States, these former information control officers went back to the United States and they took positions. Some of them became insurance salesmen, but a lot of them started working in the media. And so they then had an impact on how the news was reported in the United States. First of all, as reporters, but then also as producers and things like that within the news services, writers, as editors. It wasn't only them, however. You had people like William Paley, who was the head of CBS. He had also been an information control officer at a very, very high level. And he had seen what was going on in Germany. So he brought some of these ideas back to the United States. And he had the power to actually put these things in place. He was one of these people who believed very strongly in the separation of the money end of, running a broadcasting network from their news service.
What you're saying is, as time has gone on and there's been such money put into the media and there's been more monopolizations, more mergers and acquisitions of media organizations, we're back to a situation where money controls or someone controls or one individual controls the media. And that's the trust that has been eroded. And now we don't even see who is the person who is controlling it because it's such mass media through social media like TikTok.
What we have is we have a talking head who has nothing to do with actually reporting the news. Creating the reporting that goes into the news. They're there simply to read copy. We don't see the people in behind.
So we started in Albania, and I asked the question with you, Erwin, about what is this world that we create for ourselves that allows a whole nation to be held captive? And we go all the way through to the very question of everything that we consume on media and whether that is manufactured for our consumption in a way that is there for control and or taking us to different beliefs that someone else wants us to believe. And I find that concerning, as I'm sure everyone would when you're thinking about it. But in your mind, what should people do when it comes to understanding propaganda and understanding how content can control us? And I am sure, Erwin, this is going to be one of many episodes about propaganda, simply because you and I have both studied propaganda and you've actually written about it So, what should we do?
What we should do is get beyond this notion that what we have is social media. We don't have social media. We watch people on TikTok that we don't know. How can we be social? How can that be part of our social network? We're watching TV. We're listening to radio. We're reading text. Social media is what I do with my friends, people that I know, but not simply some person, who's ranting or raving about this, that, or the other thing and how the world is unfair. I have no way of knowing how trustworthy that source is. And part of the problem with, okay, we'll use the term social media, is that it is basically untrustworthy. Remember what I said. I only allow you to know what I want you to know about me. It's the same thing about the news. They only allow us to know what it is they want us to know.
And we come to the end of this episode because we have gone from manufacturing fantasy worlds to manufacturing reality. And we ourselves are living in a manufactured reality. And it is important for us to understand what parts of it affect us and what parts we should react to and how we should understand the reality and the content that is shown to us. So thank you again for coming on the show, Erwin. We will absolutely have more episodes about propaganda. This is a great introduction.
Oh, by the way, you're summing up perfect.
Fantastic. All right, until next time.
We will see you, or well, maybe not see you, but hear you.
Thank you for listening to our discussion. I hope that it has made you consider the reality that we all live in, or how to influence the fantastical worlds that you are creating for your writing or your role-playing game. What did you think about our discussion? I would love to hear from you. Please get in touch at contact@dups.ca. Listen to the archives wherever you get your podcasts or at tales.dups.ca. That's tales.dups.ca. This podcast is about the worlds we create, the realities we conjure, and the wonders of the human imagination. The podcast, including its intro music, is produced, edited, and created by me, Dilip Ujewardena. If you are lucky enough to have a pet, give them some treats and a cuddle until we meet again for some tales under the cat tree.